I've spent a good deal of my life amongst the poorest of poor children. I started out almost exactly 40 years ago, 40 years and 2 months ago, in September of 1964, when I became a fourth grade teacher in the segregated public schools of Boston, Massachusetts. I never intended to become a teacher. I had gone to Harvard College, where I majored in English literature. Had no political ideas at all. You know, I was an English major in the 1950s. It was like being sort of the cognitive version of an eggplant. And I just had no political values. And after Harvard, by some real mistake, I won a Rhodes Scholarship. And I didn't like Oxford. At Harvard, everybody pretended to be British. You know, even the boys from Utah. So, and I was at Oxford, it seemed oddly familiar. And I spent most of those years in Paris, to be honest. When I came back to the United States in 1964, my mother and father were getting a little worried about me because, you know, when I'd gone off, I was like their golden boy, and now I was in my mid-20s and just hanging out in Harvard Square. And my father thought that a Rhodes Scholar by that age should be doing something distinguished, at very least be the governor of an insignificant state. And I was really just hanging around Harvard Square, and I felt pressure from my dad, who had gone to Harvard and Harvard Medical School himself, to go back to the university and become an English scholar, and it appealed to me very much, to be honest. I love English literature, I still do, and I would love to have spent my whole life teaching literature at the university. My heroes were my professors there, and I would like to have been one of them someday. I probably would have followed that course if for some extraordinary events that swept the nation in the early summer of that year of 1964, when hundreds of young people, the age of most of you, the undergraduates here at Amherst College, hundreds of young people, probably thousands, a few thousand, gathered at a college campus in Ohio in order to be trained in civil disobedience, nonviolent civil disobedience, and prepared to go down south to Mississippi to try to break the back of apartheid in that state by running little freedom schools. Have any of you ever heard that term? Freedom schools, which were intended to teach little kids to read, but more important, teach grown-ups how to register to vote. And the first 3 of these young people went ahead of the others early in June. They were like looking for locations and good places to have these programs. They disappeared one night in a rural area near a small town called Philadelphia, Mississippi. Disappearance of these 3 young people immediately caused a wave of alarm up north, certainly, and in the press. Alarm which proved justified a few weeks later when their bodies were found buried in the mud under an abandoned dam in Philadelphia, Mississippi, murdered, as it turned out, by the Ku Klux Klan. That event had a stunning effect on hundreds of thousands, probably millions of young people of my generation. Now, black folks had been lynched forever in the South, and the nation never paid attention, not much. But this time, it was a mixed group. They were black and white. And the nation did pay attention. And I can't quite explain how this created a sense of urgency among so many of us. It changed the lives of many of us. It probably changed my life forever. It's hard looking back to be certain it was that event alone, but I remember it was right after that event that I got in my car in Harvard Square. And what would you guess in those days? I had a little VW Bug plastered with slogans. And I drove to Roxbury, it's the black community of Boston. And I went to a church, the minister, black church, black minister, and I said, "Can I be of any use?" Just like that. I didn't know what to say. I just said, "Can I be of any use?" And he said, "Yes, you can, young man. As a matter of fact," he said, "we're setting up a freedom school right here in Roxbury to teach our kids how to read. Can you teach reading?" I said, "No, I went to Harvard." I didn't know anything useful. I just knew nothing useful. He said, "We'll teach you to teach reading." And they did. And after a few weeks, crash program, they gave me a class. And I got to like that class so much. I just became so close to those kids that when September came, I didn't like the thought of losing them. And so I just walked into the Boston School Department one day and said, "I'm going to be a teacher." Well, I'd never heard of certification. I didn't know what that was even. And they said, "Where'd you go to college?" And I said, "Harvard." And they said, "Then you can't be a teacher because you couldn't get certified at Harvard." And I said, "Well, there must be some way I could teach." And they said, "Well, you could be a sub." I said, "Why not? I'll be a sub. What the heck?" And my dad wanted me to have a job, so I took him to lunch, actually. And at the faculty club at Harvard, I took him to lunch, and he had to pay. And I said, "Dad, I have a job." "What is it?" "I'm a sub." And let me tell you, in all seriousness, that was the hardest thing I'd ever done in my life, honestly. The first time I came to admire teachers so much, right from the start, when I saw what they had to do. First time I ever taught in my life, they called me up one morning around 6 a.m. and said, "You're going to teach kindergarten." And I walked into this big kindergarten class, something like 35 children, and I had no idea what you do with people that size, like that, the little creatures. To me, they seem like gerbils or something. I had no idea what to do with them. I let them crawl on me, basically, played with them. But I survived and ultimately became a fourth grade teacher and later a fifth grade teacher. And I've spent most of the decade since working in one way or another with Black and Latino children all over the United States. For many of the years since 1993 in New York City, in the South Bronx, in a section called Mott Haven. In all, I've made about 300 visits up to the South Bronx in these years to talk with children and teachers, parents and preachers, ministers, who face challenges I couldn't even dream of 40 years ago. It's so much harder now. Mott Haven is the poorest section of the South Bronx, which is still the poorest congressional district in the United States, right next to the Upper East Side of Manhattan, which is probably one of the wealthiest census tracts in the entire world. It's only about a 5-minute subway ride from East 86th Street to this neighborhood. Life is tough for children in the area. About a quarter of the children suffer chronic asthma. Pediatric asthma has become an epidemic in many inner cities of the United States over the past 10, 15 years. I see some of you nodding who are familiar with these numbers. There are a lot of reasons why. One obvious one is the general inclination of our cities, our municipal agencies, to locate unhealthy industrial installations, such as waste burners and incinerators of various kinds, or toxic industries, in neighborhoods where people have no power. May not be overtly driven by racism, but it certainly structurally amounts to the same thing. In New York, in the early 90s, for example, the major research hospitals of Manhattan, the great hospitals of Manhattan, had to find some place to burn their waste, medical waste. And remarkably enough, the initial proposal was to build a medical waste incinerator right near the United Nations. Right, like around East 30th or East 45th Street or something like that. You can bet the parents in that neighborhood blocked that proposal quickly. They brought out experts in respiratory sickness to testify to the effects that would have on their children, on their breathing, on their respiration. Oncologists to testify to the risks of carcinogenic dangers, cancer-causing agents in the smoke, and others just to the aesthetic effects of having this foul, smelly smoke rising above their beautiful neighborhood. Now, where do you think it ended up? They put the medical waste incinerator in the South Bronx, 4 blocks from the school I write about. The kids who already had one of the highest rates of pediatric asthma in America rapidly grew worse. And while by the time I was visiting, you got used to seeing little kids, especially if they were under tension, if they're under emotional tension, which exacerbates asthma, reaching into their pocket sort of frantically to make sure they had their pump, as the kids called it, the pump, a little asthma inhaler. About a quarter of the kids I know see their fathers only when they visit them in prison. And whereas I grew up in suburban Boston, where my reference points were to sibling, older brothers, sisters, cousins, fathers, who went to Harvard or Amherst or Williams or MIT, that was where my reference points. For these kids, the prison is their reference point. They visit their fathers there on Sundays. Many of these kids know hunger, especially the end of each month. A lot of them have been homeless. That's how I met some of them first. Many have seen homicides. Almost all the children I know have lost a relative to AIDS. This is the epicenter of the HIV epidemic in not just in the United States, but in the Western world. With all the problems that these little kids face outside of school, all these socially created problems outside of the world of education, wouldn't you think that a truly good society, and I believe this is a good society, or at least we wish that we could be one, wouldn't you think a truly good society would say, look at what these kids have against them from the start. And they're completely innocent, People can stereotype or scapegoat teenagers who look tough, but what have these little babies done? They're innocent, right? They're little kids when they're 3 and 4 years old. They're as clean and pure as the child of a president or senator or anybody else. They've done nothing wrong at all. They have committed no sin. They're too small to hurt us, and they're too sweet to distrust us. The only sin they've made, if it's a theological sin, is to have chosen to be born to terribly poor people at a cold moment in our nation's history. That's their only sin. But wouldn't you think a good society would say, what the hell? With all the odds these children face, in the areas where we have power, where we make decisions in educational provision, let's give them the very best a rich society could possibly afford. Let's just pour it on. Let's give them the best we have, because they need it most. In fact, let's not wait until they enter public school. Let's start when they're still babies. Start when they're 2 or 3 years old. Give them the very best early childhood education, developmental education. Start when they're 2 or 3. Give them pediatric screenings. Check their ears. Check their eyesight. Don't wait till they're in 4th grade to find out whether they need glasses. Do it now. Check signs of any type of chronic illnesses. Give them early exposure to learning and social skills. Start when they're babies. Let's just pour it on, because we're the wealthiest society in the world, and we'd like to think that we're the best and wisest. Meanwhile, the children of the privileged are getting an infinitely richer meal during those early years. Now, you may wonder how I know, because I spend so much time with poor people, with poor children. But I know rich people. You know, they can't fool me. I grew up in privilege. Some of my Harvard classmates are very wealthy, powerful people. And they, and they talk to me. They tell me what they do for their children. Some of them like me, still like me. They're nervous with me sometimes. They think I want to redistribute their wealth, which I do. But they're my friends, and they tell me what they do, and I know what they do for their children. The affluent families in New York and many other cities put their kids into the very best, wonderful developmental preschool programs when they're 2.5 years old. That's a typical starting point, 2.5 years old. And they get that typically for 3 years before they even enter public school. And these schools are expensive, let me tell you, because they spend a lot to make wonderful provision for these children. The best pre-Ks in New York now cost $22,000 a year. That's for a 2.5-year-old. And they're so competitive, there's now, they give tests. Don't ask me what kind of test you give a 2-year-old. I don't know what you test her on. It's probably some sadist who's figured it out. And many of the affluent people I know do send their kids to public school in New York City in the elementary years. And suddenly they're taking tests, because that's the new regime now, decreed by Washington. Suddenly they're taking exams, not just exams that we used to take, but high-stakes exams. Now, so they take these tests like at 3rd grade, and it determines whether you get promoted. And if you fail it, you have to repeat 3rd grade. Everyone who worked in early childhood knows very well that if children who repeat 1 grade have a vastly lower chance of ever graduating. If you repeat twice, it cuts your chance of ever graduating by 90%. And you know where else they use these tests? Sometimes in 2nd grade or 1st grade to determine who gets into gifted and talented programs. Were any of you ever in a gifted program or talented? See, a lot of you. It determines that. Now, who do you think does best on these high-stakes exams? The kids who have had 2 or 3 wonderful years of rich developmental education, who have been sitting on those consonant blends, and who have been maybe learning to play little tunes on a violin, and learning how to relate to one another, and learning organizational skills and shapes, and how to hold a pencil or a crayon, are the ones who have had nothing. I'm sure you can guess the answer. That's just brutal. All the kids I describe, as you probably guessed, go to profoundly segregated public schools. I say this all the time when I'm in a school and never see any white kids. I usually don't bother to, I'm in the school and I don't see any white children at all. I don't feel like that I need to go home and search some database to find out if this is integrated or not. Because I have good eyes. Well, actually I don't, but I have good glasses and I can see. So if I'm in a school all day, and there are maybe 1,000 kids in the school, and I never see a white kid all day, I'll say to myself, I think this is segregated. I'm sort of a simple-minded guy. 4 years ago, when my last book went to press, there were 11,000 children in this little sub-district of the New York public schools, the elementary and middle schools. 11,000 children in the schools in that neighborhood. Of those 11,000, exactly 26 were white children. 26. Not 2,600, 26 children. Now it's 22. But let's stick with 26 to be optimistic. Let's figure how segregated is that? Well, I'm not good at statistics. I went to a progressive school in Newton, but I can do long division. That's a segregation rate of 99.8%. 0.2 percentage point now marks the difference between legally enforced apartheid in the South of 50 years ago and socially and economically enforced apartheid in most of our northern cities now. You go into almost any school in the South Bronx, 99.8% black and Hispanic. Almost any school in Philadelphia, where I was yesterday, or almost any school in Cincinnati, or Cleveland, Milwaukee, Chicago. Thinking of places I've been recently, St. Louis, San Francisco, San Diego, LA. You go into the school, you look around the room, you look into the faces of the children. If you dare, you look into their eyes and try to tell yourself this modernized millennial apartheid is what Dr. Martin Luther King and all our other martyrs died for. We celebrate Brown. Big commemoration recently, 50th year. But in a very real sense, we've ripped apart the legacy of Brown. It's been virtually dismantled by the federal courts during the past 10 years. In a very real sense, we've gone back to Plessy. Separate but equal, 1896. But we haven't even yet lived up to Plessy. The schools are separate, but nobody who sees these schools would argue that they're equal. 4 years ago, when I was finishing my last book, most recent book, I looked at what we spend for children in New York compared to children in the suburbs. At that point, New York City was spending about $8,000 for each little kid I knew in the South Bronx. That's all the money available to the school from city, state, pittance of federal funds. $8,000 per pupil. Have any of you read my recent book, Ordinary Resurrections, I'm glad some of you have, which is about some of these kids. So you've met like Pineapple, this lovely little girl who bosses me around all the time. There's a plump little girl who was about 7, it was 5 when I met her, who just started ordering me around right from the start. And I always obeyed her because there's something strangely authoritative about her. And so, picture little Pineapple in her sort of glorious, charming energy and all her promise. $8,000 for her education each year. You lift her up in your grown-up arms, you plunk her down, Simply in an average suburb of New York, not a particularly wealthy one, she'd be getting $12,000 put into her public education every year. You lift her up in your good and capable grown-up arms, and you plunk her down in one of the wealthiest white suburbs out there on Long Island, a district like Manhasset or Great Neck. She'd be getting $18,000 put into her public education every single year. $8,000 in the South Bronx, $18,000 out there in the most affluent white suburbs. In all our religions, we say that all our children are of equal value in the eyes of God. All religions believe that. All our children are of equal value in the eyes of God. And in the eyes of God, my friends, I'm sure they are. But not in the eyes of America. In the eyes of America, because of the unjust, undemocratic, and archaic way we finance public education, our children come into the classroom with a price tag printed on their forehead. The little ones I write about are cheap children. They're like Kmart babies. They're $8,000 babies. You want to see an $18,000 baby, you have to go out to the rich suburbs. That's just unacceptable in a nation that would like to view itself as a good society. Sometimes when I'm in these inner city schools for months on end, I forget what it's like in schools that serve the mainstream of the nation. You actually forget. You start to think in terms of, make do. Like, what would make this separate and unequal school run more efficiently? Which is pretty much, what the standards movement is about. But you forget what goes on in wonderful schools that have plenty of money. So I went back last spring into some good suburban schools in order to remind myself what money buys for children in a middle class or affluent community. One of the wonderful things it buys is lots of warm and personal attention from a teacher who has time to listen to each child patiently, to enjoy each child's personality. Not to feel she's under the sword because she has so many students in her class and because there's so much pressure from state accountability demands that she can't pause to pay attention to this child. She's under that sword. In many inner city schools, they use the term time on task. In some of these inner city schools, the principals are so terrified of the day when the test scores are announced in the newspapers that they spend most of the year drilling children for the tests, and they use what are called scripted lesson plans, where everything is where the teacher reads scripted answers and the children it reads scripted questions, the children give scripted answers, and there's no time for critical thinking at all. And many principals who deeply value the best traditions of wise and well-balanced education comply with these demands because they're under the sword, because they're so frightened the day those test scores are released. In New York City, the school that scores lowest, it's right there in the New York Daily News or New York Post. The 10 worst schools in the city, how would you like to be that principal? So the teachers have no opportunity to interrupt and pay attention to that child who might have some learning problem, but also might be trying to give her a signal by doing something that isn't in the script. Here's a typical example. Teachers in elementary school ask children questions. And little children, and this is something I love about them, when they're spunky and healthy, they're just great at getting you off track, not answering the question you asked. And I've when I'm asked to teach a class, this happens all the time. And I watch practice teachers, and it even happens to them, that children, like you ask a question on some official subject that you're supposed to ask that day, and this little guy insists on telling you what happened at the zoo on Sunday, and it's very important to him to tell you this, and he goes way off track, and he keeps adding on ands and buts, and I happen to like run-on sentences, as you've probably noticed. I've tried to adopt it as my literary genre, and but they go on and on with this, and kids are good at that, and I think that's one of the entitlements of childhood, and to meander into the blissful kingdom of irrelevance, and one of these little munchkins gets off track and is telling you, is wandering way off. The teacher can afford to listen, and instead of getting panicked and wondering if this is in the state standards or not, she can follow that little course, and sometimes if she does, she finds a secret treasure at the end, and that treasure turns out to be the key that unlocks that child's motivation, and she follows up on it when she has time, and he starts writing, because she found the thing he loves, or fears, or hates, whatever it is. But in these schools, in the inner city schools I visit, teachers, with rare exceptions, cannot do that. In an inner city school I visited also last spring in Los Angeles, this was a high school. Teacher who invited me to her school had 40 students in her class. These high school kids, 10th graders. 40 students in her class. She taught 6 classes every day, including homeroom. She had 6 classes of 40 kids every day. This was in a huge school with 4,000 kids in the school. So crowded, it ran right through the summer on different tracks. Have you ever heard of that? It just kept going all year long. So some of the kids, 2/3 of the kids had to go to school during those torrid summer months. It was very moving. Students at that school were forced against their will to take vocational courses. Have you ever heard of that happening in the low-scoring kids in some schools? Well, in this case, all the kids in this school, even the ones who wanted to go to college. Mariah had her eyes set on college. She wanted to come to Boston, to New England. She'd been forced the previous year to take hairdressing. Now, that's been a classic for segregated schools for decades in America, giving black and Latino kids courses in hairdressing. Mariah had taken hairdressing. Now she said she has to take sewing. I said, what would you rather do? She said, I wanted to take an AP course. They had very few spaces in AP. They had lots of sewing courses. And then she started to cry right in front of me. She said, I don't want to take sewing. I already know how to sew. My mother is a seamstress in a sewing factory. I want to go to college. And there was this tough kid in the class, this guy. He had this shrewd and kind of angry look. And a lot of these guys who look tough have a certain angry brilliance, if you can ever elicit it. And he got burningly angry suddenly for her sake. But he looked at me with this cynical look, and he said, the owners of the sewing factories need workers, right? And I didn't answer him. Mariah said, I guess they do. And he said, and they're not going to hire their own kids for those jobs, are they? And somebody said, why not? And Mariah said, so they can grow beyond themselves, but we remain the same. And he was sort of unrelenting. He said, you're ghetto, so you learn to sew. People people often say to me, how do you keep from getting profoundly depressed on spending so much time in these inner city schools in the poorest neighborhoods? And I always say, actually, the place I get really depressed is Washington. When I go to Washington, D.C., I always leave there feeling horrible. I always feel depressed because everybody in power, even the people who really are fond of me, will say, these things take time, Jonathan, be patient. Like concerning the Brown decision, they say, be patient, these things take a while. Concerning preschool for little children, they've been saying this for 40 years. Be patient, someday we'll give all those little kids the wonderful preschool they deserve. And, it makes me so angry. Don't listen to anybody older who tells you to be patient about social justice issues, because patience on these kinds of issues is the luxury of people who are not in pain. For people who are in pain, it's an intolerable injustice because, they say to me, even my allies on Capitol Hill, for years I used to go and testify in front of Senate committees. They'd say, Jonathan, someday we're going to give Head Start and good, wonderful early developmental education to all the little kids you write about. Some of the senators or congressmen have come up to meet the kids I've written about. And, and they always say how adorable they are, but that's not good enough, That's not good enough to give them hugs. Because you got to keep faith with them when you're not giving them hugs, when you're at a distance, when you're wielding power. And they'll say on Capitol Hill, in these hearings, which I used to do, I call them like the penultimate boring C-SPAN hearings. Those things? They say, be patient, someday we'll give this to these kids. And I say, someday isn't good enough for children who are 3 years old today, because they will never be 3 years old again. There are some forms of theft where we can make good later on for people who've been robbed. Your car is stolen, there's a chance you can get it back, right? The house is vandalized, there's a chance court can get you reimbursed someday. But who can give back the third year of life to a little girl, the fourth year of life, the fifth year of life to a little kid? This is the irreversible theft. Once it's gone forever. So that's why I'm not patient any longer. And so I get depressed in Washington, but I actually, when I go into the schools, once, while I'm there with the kids themselves, especially the little kids, I usually feel stirred by the possibilities that I see within them, especially when I'm with the little ones. My last book is mostly about, my latest book is mostly about kids who are still only 6 or 7 or 8 years old, and they haven't been damaged yet, or if they have, it's not apparent, and they're not hard. Most of the kids, they're not all perfect little babies, and I don't romanticize them and, say they're all little angels, because some of them can drive me up the wall, to be honest. But, all kids, I think poor kids have equal rights with rich kids to be obnoxious. And, they're not like poster children for the poor, but in their multitude of personalities, these kids are pretty much like children everywhere at this age. They're gentle children by and large. They're kind unfailingly to strangers, and they always worry about older people. They worry about me far more than I can worry about them. This little boy, Mario, whom I've written about in 2 of my books, first time I ever met him, I said, how old are you, Mario? This was in a church, in an after-school program, an Episcopal church. I said, how old are you, Mario? He says, I'm 6. How old are you? They do that. I said, I'm 60. He immediately started stroking my hand.
You know, like that. And a little child's hand is very soft. You know, he kept stroking my wrist like that, and he looked up at me and said, "Oh, Jonathan, I hope you're not going to die." Because it sounds like 60 sounds like probably like 280 to him. And then he ran to tell the priest how old I was, because I needed immediate attention, you know. And he ran to tell his grandma, who was in the kitchen of the church. And I've seen him behave that way with other older people, too. I've seen a lot of them behave that way. Of all the grown-ups I brought with me, the one who meant the most to that community, at least to the kids, and probably to the teachers, and I guess to their parents and grandparents, too, was someone I bet every one of you would love to spend a day of your life with, if it were still possible. Mr. Rogers, Fred Rogers. He was in New York. He said, "I'd like to meet the kids in your last book." And he said, it was such a modest man, he says, "Do you think I'd be intimidating to them?" "No, I think they can handle it, you know." So, and he said, "How do you usually go?" And I said, "Well, I usually go on the train, number 6 train, which is the quickest way." He said, "Okay, let's go on the train, on the subway, you know. There's no trolley in New York," so we went to the subway. I have to admit, I was sort of excited. I felt like a little kid myself. Wouldn't you? Wouldn't you feel excited? I was sitting there thinking, wow. I get to think like, wow, I'm on the New York subway with Mr. Rogers, you know. And we went up to the Bronx and went up to a rough neighborhood at that time, Brook Avenue, which was the center of the drug trade, crack cocaine trade at that moment. We were just walking up the street together, and I worried. I thought maybe no one would know who he is, you know. Nonsense. A sanitation truck came screeching to a halt. And the driver was a 50, 60-year-old black man, jumped out and lifted Mr. Rogers off the ground. And then we went to the public school, and I always try to do that in order to pay respect to the teachers who have been in the trenches all these years, because it meant something to them to have Fred Rogers come to their classroom, and you can bet he didn't ask them anything about their test scores, you know. He just asked about the children. And then we went to the church, the after-school program, and it was packed. Mario spots Mr. Rogers right away. Well, you know, if little kids don't like you, they can make it awful clear, you know. They can be mean. They can, but and he was like that. He could just walk away from you. But if he likes you, you're in for it. And as soon as he sees Mr. Rogers, he goes straight across the room, sort of like a World War II attack plane. That's how I thought of it, his wings spread wide. The minute of collision, he wraps them around Mr. Rogers, kisses him on the forehead, looks him right in the eyes, and says, "Welcome to my neighborhood, Mr. Rogers." And Fred Rogers never forgot that.